Hey guys, welcome back to Beyond the Box Score, and I am your host Hayat. Today we're breaking down 4 NBA matchups on March 11th, and I'm walking through them exactly the way I do on camera, thinking out loud, working through the spots, the travel situations, the momentum swings, and the matchup angles that could decide these games. We're diving into Cleveland Cavaliers vs Orlando Magic, Denver Nuggets vs Houston Rockets, New Orleans Pelicans vs Toronto Raptors, and Los Angeles Clippers vs Minnesota Timberwolves. 4 really interesting spots on the board tonight, and each one has a different storyline: revenge angles, back-to-backs, altitude games, teams fighting for playoff positioning. All the little details that can quietly shape how these games actually play out. So the goal here is simple. I'm not just reading numbers, I'm connecting the dots. I'm looking at the scheduling spots, the recent form, the trends, and asking one question. If this game plays out the way the situation suggests, what side actually makes the most sense? This is pure analysis and opinion, no guarantees, no promises, just me working through the slate the same way I do every day. And real quick before we jump in, we're pushing toward 2,000 subscribers here on Beyond the Box Score. So if you enjoy these full slate breakdowns and the thinking out loud style analysis, hitting that subscribe button would honestly mean a lot. Alright, let's get into it and start connecting the dots. Cleveland Cavaliers vs Orlando Magic. The lean here is Cleveland Cavaliers minus 3.5. Okay, let me walk through why. Because when I first see Cleveland Cavaliers heading into Orlando to play the Orlando Magic and the number sitting at Cleveland Cavaliers minus 3.5 with a total of 226.5, my immediate reaction is, wait a second, that feels a little bit short. And I get it. I understand what the Orlando Magic are doing right now because on paper they look hot. They've won 4 straight games, so if you're just glancing at the board you're thinking okay, Orlando Magic are rolling. But then I start digging into who those wins actually came against, and that's where my brain kind of slows down and starts thinking this through. Because those 4 straight wins came against the Washington Wizards, the Dallas Mavericks, the Milwaukee Bucks, and the Minnesota Timberwolves. Now look, I'm not going to pretend that Minnesota Timberwolves win wasn't impressive because that's a solid win. But if this matchup plays out like the recent form suggests, I still have to ask myself, how much stock do I really put into wins against the Washington Wizards, the Dallas Mavericks, and the Milwaukee Bucks right now? 3 of those 4 wins are against teams that really aren't scaring anybody at the moment. So yes, the Orlando Magic have momentum. Yes, they've won 4 straight games, but I keep coming back to the fact that Cleveland Cavaliers have already seen this matchup twice this season, and both times Cleveland Cavaliers handled it. The first meeting was January 24th in Orlando and the Cavaliers won by 14. Then just 2 days later on January 26th they ran it back in Cleveland and that one wasn't even close by the end. The final score: Cavaliers 114, Magic 98. So when I'm thinking through how this matchup could unfold tonight, one path I see here is Cleveland Cavaliers simply repeating the formula that already worked twice this season. Cleveland Cavaliers have already beaten Orlando Magic twice this season, and that matters because sometimes teams just match up well stylistically, and when I see Cleveland Cavaliers minus 3.5 sitting there, I can't help but think about what the number would look like if this were Cleveland Cavaliers minus 5.5 instead. Because if the line were Cleveland Cavaliers minus 5.5, yeah, maybe I'd start talking myself into the Orlando Magic side. Maybe I'd say okay, the Orlando Magic are playing better ball, they've won 4 straight games, maybe there's a case there. But at Cleveland Cavaliers minus 3.5 the number just doesn't feel heavy enough to push me away from Cleveland Cavaliers. And then there's the injury note that I keep circling back to: Jared Allen, questionable. Because if Jared Allen is available, if he's active, if he's on the floor protecting the paint and controlling the glass, then this matchup starts to look very similar to what we already saw on January 24th and January 26th. And sure, there's the narrative floating around that this could be a triple revenge spot for the Orlando Magic, since Cleveland Cavaliers have already beaten Orlando Magic twice this season, but revenge angles only matter if the matchup actually flips somewhere on the court. What connects for me is that Cleveland Cavaliers already proved twice that they can control this matchup, once by 14 in Orlando and then again with a final score of Cavaliers 114, Magic 98 in Cleveland. So when I see Cleveland Cavaliers minus 3.5 with a total of 226.5, and I weigh that against Orlando Magic winning 4 straight games against the Washington Wizards, Dallas Mavericks, Milwaukee Bucks, and Minnesota Timberwolves, I keep coming back to the same thought: the number feels short. And that's why the lean sticks at Cleveland Cavaliers minus 3.5. Next game we have Denver Nuggets versus Houston Rockets. The lean here is Denver Nuggets. Okay, let me walk through why, because this matchup starts getting really interesting the moment you look at the context around both teams. Denver Nuggets come into this game at 39-26 with a 36-29 record against the spread, and they're coming off a 129-126 loss against Oklahoma City. And when I'm thinking about how teams respond after a loss like 129-126 versus Oklahoma City, sometimes that kind of game sharpens the focus a little bit. But the Nuggets' recent form isn't just about that Oklahoma City game, because you also have to remember they lost to New York by 39 points at home earlier. Losing by 39 points at home is the kind of thing that sticks with a team, the kind of thing that lingers in the locker room a little bit. So when I'm thinking through what version of the Denver Nuggets shows up here, that's the big question, because we've seen both extremes. We've seen the Nuggets team that can look dominant, and we've also seen the Nuggets team that lost to New York by 39 points at home. Now flip over to the Houston Rockets side, and the first thing that jumps out at me is the schedule situation. The Houston Rockets are in the first half of a back-to-back, and they're playing the Toronto Raptors on Tuesday before this game. That matters because if this matchup plays out like a typical back-to-back travel scenario, Houston Rockets are going from that Toronto Raptors game straight into a road game. And not just any road game, they're going on the road into Denver altitude. And altitude is always one of those subtle factors that starts creeping into the game the longer it goes. Over the course of the season, the Houston Rockets haven't exactly been dominant in these situations either, because their against the spread record with no rest sits at 5-5. That's perfectly average, perfectly neutral, nothing special. And the scoring margin in those spots is plus 0.7 points per game, which tells me those games are razor thin. That plus 0.7 points per game average basically screams coin flip territory, where Houston Rockets might win some, might lose some, might barely scrape by. So now I'm layering that over the location, over the altitude, over the schedule spot, and the path I keep seeing is Denver Nuggets having the situational edge. And then there's the Western Conference standings context that adds another layer to this whole thing. The Nuggets are 1/2 game behind the Lakers for the 5 seed, while the Rockets currently sit in the 4 seed. The Rockets could move to 3rd, and Denver could fall to 6th, and suddenly you're staring at a potential first-round playoff matchup depending on how the standings shift. So if this matchup plays out with that playoff intensity baked in, I think the Denver Nuggets recognize the importance of this spot. They're 39-26, they're 36-29 against the spread, they're coming off a 129-126 loss against Oklahoma City, they've had that embarrassing loss to New York by 39 points at home hanging over them, and now they get Houston Rockets coming in on the first half of a back-to-back after playing the Toronto Raptors on Tuesday with that 5-5 against the spread no rest trend and the plus 0.7 points per game scoring margin in those spots. What connects for me is the location, the altitude, the schedule edge, and the standings pressure all pointing toward the same direction. And when I line all of that up in my head, that's why the lean sticks at Denver Nuggets. Quick pause for a second. If you've got an even one lean you like so far from these breakdowns, whether it was Cleveland versus Orlando, Denver versus Houston, New Orleans versus Toronto, or the Clippers versus Timberwolves, hit the like button. It tells me these full slate NBA breakdowns are actually helpful and worth doing. And if you're new here and enjoy this kind of thinking through the game's style analysis, consider hitting subscribe as well. We're on the road to 2K subscribers, and it might take just a second for you, but it honestly means a lot for the growth of the channel. Alright, let's jump back into the next matchup. Next game we have New Orleans Pelicans versus Toronto Raptors. The lean here is Toronto Raptors. Okay, let me walk through why, because when I start thinking through this matchup the first thing that jumps out to me is the schedule situation around the Toronto Raptors. They're on the first half of a back-to-back and they're playing the Houston Rockets on Tuesday, so right away I'm asking myself what version of this team shows up when the schedule compresses a little bit. Because historically that can matter, and when I look at the numbers for the Toronto Raptors on no rest this season, they're 5-6 against the spread and they're losing games by an average of -5.9 points per game. That's not exactly screaming dominance, and that's where the internal debate starts for me. Because the matchup itself is against the New Orleans Pelicans, and this Pelicans team is sitting at 21-45 on the year with a 37-29 record against the spread this season. And that number, the 37-29 against the spread mark, kind of makes me pause because that tells me this group has been fighting harder than their overall record suggests. Now if this matchup plays out like recent form suggests, you could make the argument that New Orleans Pelicans are playing some of their best basketball recently. They just picked up a 138-118 win over the Washington Wizards, and that's the type of scoreline where you look at it and think, okay, that game was never really in doubt. They've alternated wins and losses in 4 straight games, and overall they've won 6 of their last 9 games. But then my brain starts digging deeper into who those wins came against, and that's where context starts mattering. Because the 4 most recent wins include Utah twice, Sacramento once, and Washington Wizards once. So that's Utah with 2 wins, Sacramento with 1 win, Washington Wizards with 1 win. And when I see that, the path I start visualizing is a Pelicans team that can absolutely compete with teams around their level, but the moment the competition level rises, the story tends to change. And the standings kind of support that bigger picture because the New Orleans Pelicans are 10.5 games out of the final play-in tournament spot with 16 games remaining. That's the kind of gap where realistically you're looking at the calendar and thinking, okay, the postseason path probably isn't there. Yet they're still competing, they're still playing hard, they're still finding ways to win games like that 138-118 game against Washington Wizards. But then I go back to the bigger profile of the Toronto Raptors, and this is where the matchup logic clicks for me. Because the identity of the Raptors right now is actually pretty simple, they beat bad teams and struggle against good teams. That's the profile. And when I stack that against what we've seen from New Orleans Pelicans when the competition level rises, the evidence lines up with that narrative. The Pelicans covered versus Phoenix but still lost that game on the road. They lost at Lakers. They lost at Clippers. They even lost at home versus Bucks after the All-Star break. The one exception in that stretch is that they beat the Sixers. So if this matchup plays out like the patterns we've seen all season, the path I keep circling back to is the Toronto Raptors playing the role they've been comfortable in, the team that beats bad teams. And I think that's the key question here: which category do the New Orleans Pelicans fall into right now? A team that's quietly competitive at 37-29 against the spread, or a team that's still 21-45 and sitting 10.5 games out of the final play-in tournament spot with 16 games remaining? Because if the Raptors' identity holds true and they continue to beat bad teams while struggling against good teams, then this matchup fits that pattern. And even though the Toronto Raptors are on the first half of a back-to-back with that 5-6 against the spread no-rest trend and that -5.9 points per game average margin in those spots, the matchup logic still keeps pulling me back toward the same side. So the lean here stays with the Toronto Raptors. Yeah, that's why the lean sticks at Toronto Raptors. Last game of this video: Los Angeles Clippers versus Minnesota Timberwolves. The lean here is Los Angeles Clippers. Okay, let me walk through why, because this matchup gets really interesting once you start layering the schedule dynamics and the recent form together. The Los Angeles Clippers come into this one sitting at 32-32 on the year with a 35-29 record against the spread this season, and they're coming off a 126-118 win over the New York Knicks. And that's the kind of win where you start asking yourself if this team is finally finding a rhythm, because a 126-118 win over the New York Knicks shows some offensive flow, some shot making, some rhythm. But the other side of the court brings in the Minnesota Timberwolves, and the first thing that jumps out is their schedule situation. They're on the second half of a back-to-back after playing the Los Angeles Lakers on Tuesday. So if this matchup plays out like a typical back-to-back scenario, fatigue starts creeping in, rotations get a little shorter. And even small energy dips can swing momentum. Now the interesting part is Minnesota Timberwolves haven't been terrible in these spots. Their record on no rest sits at 6-4 against the spread, which actually suggests they've handled back-to-back situations fairly well. But then I start looking at the roster situation in the injury report context, because this is actually a fairly healthy Minnesota team right now. Kyle Anderson is available, and the other names on the injury report are two-way G League players. So in terms of core rotation pieces, Minnesota Timberwolves are basically intact. And that's important because depth is one of the strengths of this roster when everyone is available. But here's where the matchup logic starts turning for me. The Los Angeles Clippers are coming into this game with the rest advantage, and even though that has been a tricky angle historically for them. Because the Clippers are 6-10 against the spread when they have a rest advantage, I still think the context matters. Because those rest advantage games often came against higher-tier opponents where the matchup step-up was real. So if this matchup plays out like the current standings pressure suggests, I see a Los Angeles Clippers team that's feeling urgency. They're trying to get out of the play-in tournament and they're trying to sneak into the top 6, and that kind of standings pressure can sharpen focus late in the season. When I combine that urgency with the rest advantage, the 32-32 overall record, the 35-29 against the spread mark, and the momentum of that 126-118 win over the New York Knicks, the path I keep seeing is the Clippers leaning into that home court edge. And that home court factor matters when the opponent is coming in on the second half of a back-to-back after facing the Los Angeles Lakers on Tuesday. Because even though Minnesota Timberwolves are 6-4 against the spread on no rest and Kyle Anderson is available with only two-way G League players listed beyond that, the situational edge still tilts toward the Clippers for me. If this game turns into a late-game grind, if legs start getting heavy in the fourth quarter, if that schedule spot finally shows up, that's the scenario where the Los Angeles Clippers can take control. And when I line all of those threads together, the 32-32 record, the 35-29 against the spread number, the 126-118 win over the New York Knicks, the Minnesota Timberwolves' second half of a back-to-back after the Los Angeles Lakers game on Tuesday, the 6-4 against the spread no-rest trend, and the Clippers' push to get out of the play-in tournament and sneak into the top 6, the conclusion I keep coming back to is the same. The lean here is Los Angeles Clippers. Yeah, that's why the lean sticks at Los Angeles Clippers. Alright, that wraps it up for all 4 NBA matchups on March 11th, Cleveland Cavaliers vs Orlando Magic, Denver Nuggets vs Houston Rockets, New Orleans Pelicans vs Toronto Raptors, and Los Angeles Clippers vs Minnesota Timberwolves. As always, this was analysis and opinion only, nothing guaranteed, just me working through the situations, the trends, and the matchups to see how these games might unfold if the spots play out the way they look on paper. Now I'm curious how you guys are seeing this slate. Drop a Z in the comments and tell me which game stood out to you the most tonight. Maybe it's the Cavs spot, maybe Denver at home, maybe Toronto's situation, or maybe the Clippers and Timberwolves matchup. Or if you're seeing something completely different, let me know. And if you enjoy these raw, thinking out loud deep dives, make sure you like the video and subscribe as we push toward 2,000 subscribers on Beyond the Box Score. More breakdowns like this coming soon, same raw format, same deep dives, same process of connecting the dots.